Go look at the job postings the next time a German Mittelstand company announces it's investing in AI. Not the implementation roles, not the roles that mention data governance or integration or compliance. Look at the ones actually getting filled fastest. The ones with the most applicants, the ones getting the recruiter's attention. A striking share of them are sales roles. Not people who understand how the technology works or where the legal exposure sits. People who can produce the moment where a room goes quiet and somebody says, "Wow." That's not an accident. It's not really about AI. It's the honest shape of how most Mittelstand companies are buying this technology right now. And I think it's also the honest answer to why so many of them are overpaying for it, in a way that has almost nothing to do with the number on the invoice. Let me be precise about what I mean by overpaying, because it's not what most people assume. A company that pays a premium price for a system that's genuinely tested against its own documents, its own workflows, its own risk profile isn't overpaying. It's buying something real. Overpaying is paying full price or close to it for a system that was never tested against your reality at all, just against the vendor's demo data and a room full of people primed to be impressed. I wrote about this a few months back, using a filing cabinet as the example. Every AI system that understands your documents is really just sorting them into a coordinate space with a fixed number of dimensions. And whether that space actually fits the variety in your business, your product lines, your languages, your contract types, is a completely different question from how impressive the vendor spec sheet sounds. A vendor quoting a bigger number isn't automatically giving you a better system. They might just be giving you a more expensive version of the same colorblind filing cabinet, sorting your Bavarian supplier contract into whichever folder happens to be nearest and calling it a match. Nobody tests for this in the sales meeting. Nobody's incentivized to. The demo is built to produce the wow, not to survive contact with your actual document set. And by the time anyone finds out the difference, the contract's already signed. This is where I think the word overpaying actually undersells the problem, because it implies the fix is negotiating a better number on the same deal. It isn't. Two companies can sign contracts of identical size with identical sounding feature lists and end up in completely different positions 18 months later, because one of them tested fit before signing and one of them tested confidence. The invoice looked the same, the outcome didn't. That's the part a line item comparison will never catch, and it's exactly the part most Mittelstand procurement processes aren't built to catch either, because they are built to compare price and feature list, not to test whether either one holds up against reality. Here's where the regulatory piece comes in, because I've watched this exact pattern before in a different industry and it went about the way you'd expect. I remember then MiFID II original timeline was still tight enough that the full documentation fit in a briefcase. I watched the industry associations complain loudly that there wasn't enough time, and I watched the deadline slip. Just enough to let everyone exhale. I finished my own preparation early anyway, mostly out of stubbornness, and ended up being the expert pulled in later to rescue the people who'd bet the deadline would move again. Some of them won that bet more than once. All of them eventually lost it, because eventually the deadline lands for real. And when it does, you scramble exactly as hard as if it had never moved in the first place. The EU AI Act just did the same thing. The high-risk obligations under Annex 3 got pushed from August 2026 to December 2027. If your reaction to that is relief, you're playing the exact hand every MiFID II laggard played. And I gently point out how that usually ends. Here's what the relief misses. The Article 50 transparency duty is still live from August 2026, undeferred. NIS2 supply chain obligations never moved at all. And if your company signs an AI vendor contract in the second half of this year, the way plenty of Mittelstand companies are about to, that contract runs straight past December 2027 anyway. The deadline moved. Your risk didn't. It just got a longer runway to become somebody else's emergency instead of yours right now, at exactly the moment when fixing it would have been cheap. I put together 5 questions I think every serious AI vendor should be able to answer before you sign anything, and I want to walk through 2 of them here, because the answers I've actually gotten are more revealing than the framework itself. I once asked a startup pitching exactly the promise you'd want to hear. Personal data redacted before anything leaves the building. What they did about trade secret, intellectual property, anything business critical that isn't personal data but is still exactly the kind of thing you don't want vectorized and sitting somewhere you can't see it. Their answer was, we will cover that too. When I asked how they'd even recognize that kind of data as sensitive in the first place, the answer was that they'd find a way. That's not a data policy. That's a plan to eventually have a plan, priced as if it were already built. The other one is simpler and somehow gets skipped even more often. A striking amount of what gets pitched you to as our AI solution is a resold large language model with a company's own interface wrapped around it. Here's Claude, here's Copilot, look what it does with your data. If that's what you are being sold, ask the person selling it how they classify the system's risk tier when they didn't build the underlying model and can't fully explain what's inside it. Watch the pause before the answer, not just the answer. Neither of those exchanges was dishonest. That's actually the more important point. Almost nobody selling AI into the Mittelstand right now has been forced to answer these questions before, because almost nobody's asking them. The gap isn't malice. It's an entire sales motion built around a technology moving faster than anyone's had time to build the muscle for asking basic questions about it. There's a third one worth adding here, because it's the one that turns an abstract worry into a concrete operational problem. What's your process for when the system produces a confidently wrong output? Not an error message, not a crash, an answer that sounds completely plausible and is simply wrong. This happens more than anyone selling you the system will volunteer. Sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes someone in your company notices and isn't heard or is afraid to be the one who slows the room down. The companies are so focused on getting the AI to work at all that they never build the process to catch it when it doesn't. And a vendor who can't describe the process in specific terms has just told you the process doesn't exist yet. Put those 2 things together. The sales-heavy hiring pattern and the questions nobody's asking. And the overpaying problem stops being mysterious. A Mittelstand Geschäftsführer, Managing Director, evaluating an AI vendor is very rarely comparing 5 systems rigorously tested against their own documents. They are comparing how confident each pitch sounded, how impressive the demo was, whether the vendor mentioned a client name they recognized. That's not criticism of the Geschäftsführer, Managing Director. It's an accurate description of the only information the sales process actually hands them. Confidence is cheap to manufacture and expensive to verify, which means confidence is exactly what gets sold and exactly what gets paid for at full price. The actual cost shows up later, and it shows up twice. Once at signature, in a price that assumed fit nobody tested, and again quietly 18 months in when the system's been in production long enough to start handing someone a plausible wrong answer instead of an obvious error. And it takes a customer complaint or a compliance review to notice. That second cost is always bigger than the first. And it's the one nobody ever put in the original business case, because at the time nobody knew it was coming. Go back to the filing cabinet for a second, because it makes the mechanism concrete. If your vendor system doesn't have enough room in its coordinate space for the actual variety in your documents, contracts, tickets, and manuals, it doesn't fail loudly. It quietly hands your team the reddest folder in the room instead of the right one. Over and over, confidently enough that nobody questioned it until a customer does. You paid full price for a system that was never going to fit. And you won't find out for months, because the failure mode was designed by nobody in particular to look exactly like success. None of this argues against buying AI. It argues against buying it the way most Mittelstand companies currently do, which is backwards. Contract first, discover this fit second. The fix is unglamorous, which is exactly why it doesn't happen on its own. Ask the 5 questions before you sign and pay attention to how they are answered, not just whether an answer eventually arrives. Test the system against real sample of your own documents, not the vendor's demo set, before you commit budget to it. Treat the move deadline as a longer runway for a risk that's still real, not as permission to stop thinking about it until 2027. That's the most of what I actually do for clients now, not in audit for its own sake, asking the question that was supposed to get asked in the sales meeting and didn't, while it still costs less to ask than to find out the hard way. The Mittelstand isn't overpaying for AI because the technology is expensive. It's overpaying because it keeps buying the wow moment instead of the fit, and nobody sends an invoice for the difference until it's much too late to negotiate it down. That's it for today's episode of Iconoclast Insights. If your company is about to sign an AI vendor contract, ask the questions before the pen touches the paper, not after. See you in the next one.